back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of the Enlightenment period out of the scientific revolution, right? So we just left off in class, right? Having our nice little gunpowder day celebration, which was a lot of fun. Very good time. I thought it was very sweet that y'all brought those snacks in for your friends and stuff like that. Also, Kylie, shout out on the s'mores cookies. Really solid work right there. Now, going into it, though, we're going to pick up right where we left off in class on this asynchronous flip day. Now, remember, you do not have to do all of this flip at this very moment, right? You can do it, break it up a little bit, but this next flip, or this flip, and your next warm-up will be due in our next class, right? And we are zooming through this content right now because this content in particular, or this unit in particular, only has about 4 standards to it, right? And we are all up in the second one already, so we're pretty much already halfway done. Now, speaking of those standards, we are not going to study them necessarily in the order that the College Board wants us to study them in, and I'm fine with that because the way they want us to look at them is dumb. All right, so now, and we're actually going to change it up a little bit, and we're going to go through this in more of a progressive flow, all right? Now, speaking of that progressive flow, we just left off talking about the emergence of skepticism, right? We started discussing how literally the Enlightenment period, much like the Renaissance period, now the Renaissance period not as much because the Renaissance wasn't focused as much on philosophy quite as much as the Enlightenment period later would be. Now there were philosophers from the Renaissance that are important skeptics like Machiavelli, like we talked about before, like Castiglione that we talked about before, and his famous book known as the Courtier, right? Now the thing about it though is that the Enlightenment period is going to see a major reemergence of skepticism on the same kind of form of skepticism that you saw from many ancient and medieval skeptics, right? Including Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, right? Diogenes being my favorite one that Riley Penapinto and I had a conversation about him for a brief moment, right? He's a very, very funny little guy. He literally lived inside of a jar in ancient Athens, right? He was a very, very big skeptic. He used to like walk around with a lantern all the time saying, I'm looking for an honest man, but it'd be like in the middle of the day. So going into it though, you have to understand, those guys, Plato, Aristotle, and Diogenes, were really, really big at looking at the accepted norm and trying to whittle it down to find out, are these things necessarily true, and becoming very skeptical and looking at things with different lenses and trying to analyze these issues and problems. Not literally in a Descartesian way of doing it, because René Descartes could be considered a skeptic as well, but Descartes may focus on the skepticism of perception of existence, whereas these guys focused on the skepticism of society as a whole. For example, Plato and Aristotle thought democracy was the dumbest thing on the planet, right? For example, you could say Lily Treme was a skeptic today in class when she said the election to me seems really, really weird in America because it's like of this whole system of how we do it, and then also there's only 2 parties, and didn't George Washington say not to do that? Good job, Lily Treme. That's using your noggin, and that skeptical noggin as well. So going into it though, you have some other skeptics as well, including Cicero, who was an ancient skeptic who hated Julius Caesar and lashed out against anybody's attempt to bring down the Roman Republic. And then this is an interesting one that I gotta shout out Shelby Wells on. St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine is also considered a little bit of a skeptic as well. Ironically enough, he's more of a skeptic in how he refuted skepticism, right? So St. Augustine actually believed in the concept of faith more prominently than a lot of other early skeptics did, and he actually used skepticism rhetoric to refute the skepticism of Christianity, which is a funny little thing about it, right? He's like a skepticism within a skepticism against skepticism, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that a lot of what's going to happen is that Europeans during the 15, 16, and 1700s, primarily during the 16 and 1700s, are going to begin to apply that skepticism to society, right? And it's going to lead to the emergence of a lot of new philosophers, philosophies, and ideas about society, right? Now, our first 2 that we got to start off with are 2 very, very famous individuals that are basically the roots of the Enlightenment, right? The roots and the foundation of the Enlightenment began with 2, not 1, but 2 English philosophers, right, who conjectured on the best way for humans to be ruled over. Now, the first one we got to know is a man by the name of Thomas Hobbes, and he is this guy right here, okay? Thomas Hobbes is going to be a very, very important figure in the in the English form of the Enlightenment, which is where the Enlightenment truly really begins. Now, if we look at England and English history, that makes a lot of sense because both of these guys, with Hobbes and Locke, are going to be living during what is known as the English Civil War period, the Interregnum period, aka Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth period, the Restoration period, and so on and so forth. Now, Hobbes, I don't think, lived to see the Restoration period, but I'm not positive. I'll have to look that up. But we are going to notice that both Hobbes and Locke looked at the tumultuous nature of English history leading up to the English Civil War, with the multiple dissolvings of Parliament, with the 11 years of tyranny, with all that stuff going on, leading all the way into the Glorious Revolution, where an entire government was overthrown without spilling a drop of blood, And they are going to use those experiences to try and understand how society can better progress its way forward. Now, Thomas Hobbes wrote his very famous book known as the Leviathan, right? Now, the Leviathan is a really, really important text because it outlines Hobbes's belief about society. Now, interestingly enough, during this time period, Hobbes is going to have a revelation, right? During the time period of the English Civil War period and as well during the Commonwealth, because I know that Hobbes lived during that part, Hobbes is going to realize that the worst thing about society is not a king, not a prince, not the way the Stuarts were ruling, but it actually instead was humans themselves, right? He believed that human beings were disgusting, awful, ungovernable monsters that literally will stab one another if need be for like gaining something for themselves, and that they needed an absolutist ruler to intervene for them. And that was the premise of his book known as the Leviathan. He believed that humans were awful and that not the king was the monster, but the king was instead the noble hero that was coming to slay the monster, because the monster was instead the people themselves, right? Because what a Leviathan is in Greek mythology is referring to a faceless, formless monster that lives under the water, right? Basically like a Kraken-esque kind of thing, right? And that the king is the only thing that can actually come along and quell that monster and prevent it from killing others or harming itself, right? And so he believed that human beings were disgusting and awful and they needed to give up their power to a strong central leader, and he created this thing known as the social contract, right? Hobbes is going to be the very first person to create this. Now, when we look at modern day society, a lot of us would say, Hobbes, you're ridiculous, because you know what? In the modern era, he is, right? You can't take Hobbes' idea and apply them to the modern era, because literally he was living in the 1600s in England, and also the idea that an absolutist ruler will save people from themselves is kind of dumb. Like now, and especially in the modern era. Now, going into it, though, we need to understand that this contract that he creates, though, regardless of if it makes any sense, is still going to be an important route for the Enlightenment, because his contemporary, John Locke, is going to refute this idea, and he's like, no, the absolutist idea is a bad one, right? So, just like I just said. So, going into it, though, what we need to understand is what the social contract is, all right? So, Thomas Hobbes created this concept known as the social contract that's basically an equal giving and taking between the governed and the government, all right? So you see what I'm talking about? We got two entities in this agreement, right? We have the government that is meant to do certain services for the people, and then you have the governed, or the people, who are meant to do certain things to keep the government running, right? Now, the thing about it is in Hobbes' version of the social contract, you need to give your rights up to a strong central leader so he can protect you from yourself, right? So you give up your rights of freedom of speech. You give up your rights of freedom of assembly. You give up your rights of freedom of like weapon ownery or any other kind of thing, or forming a militia, right? Which is actually where the Second Amendment itself comes from. So like you give up those rights that are very much outlined in our Bill of Rights to an absolutist so he can protect you from one another. Now, his contemporary, though, John Locke, is going to be a very, very famous figure as well. John Locke, though, is going to refute both premises of the Leviathan. One, he refutes the idea that human beings are bad, and he also refutes the idea that an absolutist is the way to go. And he outlines both of these concepts, well, one of the big ones, in his two treatises on government, or his second treatises on government is what it's also referred to as, and then another book called On Human Understanding, right? And in his text of two treatises on government, first and foremost, he believes that humans are actually not monsters. They are not the problem, Thomas, right? Instead, it is actually that they are amazingly powerful in their sense, right? John Locke believed that humans are naturally born with inalienable rights. I need you to write that word down. Inalienable rights. Inalienable. Inalienable means you're born with them and they cannot be taken away from you. And they sure as heck better not be taken away by any government, right? And those inalienable rights that you have, that you have born with you, is life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness, which is actually something that Thomas Jefferson is going to write, okay, later on. He's going to steal Locke's idea and twist it a little bit in some of our founding documents, and he's going to say pursuit of happiness. But what John Locke says is that you are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and that the social contract needed to be changed from Hobbes' view, because Hobbes viewed that you needed to give your rights up to an absolutist. John Locke said, no. It is the job of the government to protect those rights. And if they do not protect those rights, then all people have the right to rebellion and revolt, right? You see what I'm talking about here? This is a very interesting dynamic when you're looking at the early foundings of the Enlightenment, because these two figures that lived through something so monumental as the Glorious Revolution and the English Civil War are going to be where the bedrock of the Enlightenment begins, because they witnessed such a tumultuous overthrow and such a tumultuous clash between a government. Now, another one that he comes up with, though, as well, which becomes a theme of the Enlightenment, is all focused around how people learn, all right? So he wrote another book called On Human Understanding, and this, like I said, is a secondary theme of the Enlightenment. One that basically asks the question, what do people know? How do we know what people know? And how do we know that people know of their rights in general, right? And so on his book called On Human Understanding, he actually referred to human beings as what is known as a tabula rasa, right? Or tabula rosa, right? And what that means is a blank slate, right? So imagine a chalkboard itself with nothing on it, right? And that's what you are when you are born. But every single time you experience something, something gets written onto it, and that's what forms your conscious self. Now, this goes against what Descartes believes, because Descartes believed that the Cartesian dualistic setup of your mind and your body existing in two physical separate places. John Locke refuted this and says, no, I do not agree with that. I think actually the physical world throws onto you what you experience, and then your mental capacities come from that. Now, these two guys are going to be two of the most important people that we talk about all year, though, so never forget Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, right? But then we need to understand, as we actually are growing the Enlightenment, we are now moving over into France, right? And we are looking at the growth of what is known as the philosophe, right? And the philosophe is basically John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. They would be considered philosophers, right? Now, they weren't at the time, though, because they were the earliest reckonings and the earliest individuals of the Enlightenment. So they actually are going to be setting the tone and the tradition of the philosophe, right? But what a philosophe is an intellectual that believed that they were lighting the world with their gifts of intelligence, right? Now, the thing about it, that when we look at this, okay, the philosophe basically refers to our Enlightenment thinkers, right? And there's tons of them. We're going to end up talking about Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot. We're going to talk about Hume, Adam Smith. We're going to talk about so many different, Rousseau, possibly Kant, if we get time to actually talk about him, right? Now, going into it, though, those are all philosophers, right? And they're these individuals that pride themselves on using their intellect to try and diagnose the issues of society. So going into it, we have to understand, though, that they come from one particular country in a big, big wave, and a lot of them come from France, right? But the question you might be asking yourself, though, is, but why from France, right? Like, so now, ironically enough, Rousseau himself is actually not French. He's Swiss, but he spoke French, so that kind of counts. So now, look, going into it, though, we have to understand that France is going to be the secondary center of the Enlightenment, because the English are actually going to learn a lot from their experiences, and they don't really necessarily need to adjust, because the English Bill of Rights really represented a lot of the things that Locke believed. So the Enlightenment period didn't really continue to grow in a massive way in England, because they were already kind of doing pretty well for themselves. Now, philosophers, on the other hand, are going to grow a lot in France, because France is rife with need of reform, all right? French intellectuals, or first of all, the reason why philosophers show up a big way in France is because this area that needs reform is also the area that is home to the international language of the elite, and is the most populous country, right? French is the language that was spoken by most people in elite classes. Look at Peter the Great. Whenever you talk to him about affairs of state, you must speak to him in French, right? He also made a point to go to France on his grand tour to observe the ideas of the French government, right? And to also observe what was going on there. Even though Louis XIV was already dead by the time he got there, he still got to meet Louis XV, even though he was just like a wee little lad at the time, right? Now, French citizens, though, also had both legal and illegal forms of printed material and information. Now, what I'm getting at with that is you have to understand that France was home to a lot of different print shops, and also information was disseminating in France very rapidly. So people who needed to write or wanted to write, you could easily get it to a legal print shop or an illegal print shop, and actually negatively and illegally get some stuff out there. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on too when we get to Voltaire, because he thinks that there should be no such thing as a form of the illegal press. He believes that you should be able to express yourself fully, but that's a big part of what I'm talking about with France was in need of reform, right? Because in France, they literally had language and stuff that you could or could not say, and they also had forms of literature that you were not allowed to buy because it went against the royals and the ruling class of the Bourbons, right? Now, the other thing we need to understand about French philosophers is that they seek to spread their word to the educated nobles, not the poor, right? Now, so what I mean by that is that you're just going to have a very large upper elite class in France that's going to be very receptive to a lot of the ideas that these French philosophers begin to put out, right? Not that they don't believe in helping the poor, because many philosophers and their ideas believe in trying to fix society by engaging the nobles to aid the poor and help those people. You have to understand that basically this whole concept will grow very quickly, though, because the nobles in France are actually willing for reform, and they're a very willing party to open up to these ideas, right? Now, the thing that when we look at this is you have to understand is it very much looks like something we saw pop up in the Renaissance. Now, during the Renaissance, we're going to see this thing emerge known as the Republic of Letters, right? Where people like Erasmus. And if you don't remember who that guy is, this is why you always have to kind of study a little bit throughout the year, right? But guys like Erasmus and Martin Luther, who you would consider to be a part of two different movements in European history, actually knew each other, met one another, and exchanged letters with one another, right? If you look at Martin Luther himself, before he wrote the 95 Theses and then sent his letter off and stuff like that, that would become the 95 Theses, he is going to actually send it to multiple different Renaissance style thinkers and humanists to ask, does this make sense? Can you edit these things for me? Basically what the Republic of Letters was in Europe that had grown during the Renaissance, really hardened during the Reformation, and was continuing to burst into the forefront by the Enlightenment period, was an international exchange of printed material and letters and ideas through different elites and intellectuals throughout Europe. And the thing about it is, going into the Enlightenment period, this republic had now been so established by this point that so many of these thinkers had manuscripts to send around to each other, right? It's kind of like if I had an idea, I would send it to my beautiful, amazing wife for her to look it over before I just send it off. Isn't that right, sweetheart? That's right. No, so, yeah, now look, so going into it, though, you have to understand that Republic of Letters thing is going to be very, very important. Now, speaking of the philosophes that do pop up from France, we got to kind of zero in on a couple of big ones. Right now, this guy right here is one of the biggest philosophes of France, and he's one of the most important Enlightenment thinkers that we'll talk about during this entire unit, right? And he is a man by the name of Baron de Montesquieu. Right now, Baron de Montesquieu, who is going to be active and also alive from 1689 to 1755, to give you a gauge of when the Enlightenment is beginning to pop up, right? Now, notice really quickly, this guy was born after the Glorious Revolution, right? A year after the Glorious Revolution, he bursts onto the scene as a child, right? Like so, but Baron de Montesquieu, who is a very, very easy guy to forget his name sometimes. I always like to tell this little story about a kid that I used to teach back in the day named Shane Slack, who used to always say his name Baron de Montesquieu, which I find to be hilarious, and it makes me laugh every single time I hear it. So like now, Baron de Montesquieu is going to be really important though, because he's going to show up as a very rich and very smart man, all right? So, like, he is descendant of the upper classes of French nobility, and he was a landed noble with both land and title when he was born, right? Hence why he's known as the Baron de Montesquieu, not as just Greg de Montesquieu, right? Now, the Baron de Montesquieu, though, is also going to begin his study of French society, writing a very famous book early on known as the Persian Letters. He writes that book in 1721, and the entire point of the book itself is it follows around two individuals from what you would call Persia at the time, which is now modern-day Iran, and watches them actually observe French society. And when they're actually walking around, they're mocking it and making fun of it in a lot of ways. And they're like, why do they eat this way? Why do they do these things? And what it's meant to be is one of the earliest works of satire during the Enlightenment, right? Now, satire becomes a very, very important style and type of writing during the Enlightenment, and the Persian Letters are a really, really good example of that. What satire is poking fun at society, right? It's making fun of it in light and in jest to try and show you its inadequacies and its downfalls in a humorous way, right? But this book called The Persian Letters actually kind of throws him onto the scene and becomes one of his earliest pieces of written work that actually gets him a little bit of a reputation, right? And like I said, he was a very, very powerful landed noble, but about 20 years later, he's going to come out with his book that's going to really rock some people's socks, right? And this thing is what really puts him on the scene as an Enlightenment philosopher. Now, the book that he writes is known as The Spirit of Laws, right? And he writes it in 1748. Now, he's going to publish this anonymously, mostly due to the fact that he's scared of the outcome of what happens if people find out that he wrote it, right? But what he does in this book is he advocates for going away from absolutism and instead introducing a constitutional style government that is very much so based on the English style of government, right? And he actually creates a book, in this book known as The Spirit of Laws, he advocates for the separation of powers, right? He believes that strong governments can only exist if they have their powers separated, right? And if you want an example of a separated branch government, look at the American government, right? The American government has a 3-branch government, including the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches that all have certain things they can and cannot do. There are certain powers that they have over one another to make sure that no branch is particularly too large and intense, right? And this brings rise to that idea. Those things that they can do are known as checks and balances, right? Which is also outlined in his book. which is actually gets away from absolutists because absolutists have unchecked power, but the idea that he's introduces concepts of checks and balances. You can see that, for example, in our American government because the president can veto a law, but then the Senate can overturn the president's veto by a 2/3 vote, right? So like that's actually some kind of interesting things just to show you the differences between those checks and balances ideas. And now the thing about it though is once this comes out, even though it was published anonymously and he was able to avoid capture, arrest, or possibly imprisonment, it will be added to the index of banned books, along with De Rev, along with Galileo's Dialogue in the Two World Systems, and it was criticized heavily in France. But the British loved it. So yeah, the British actually refused to put it on the banned book list, and they just kept reading it and stuff like that because they thought it was awesome that their style of government was kind of being like admonished and like really, really being held up there, right? Now, another very famous like Enlightenment figure that we will talk about in class when I see you guys again on Tuesday next week is this man named Francois Marie Arouet, which is not even his real name, or excuse me, which is his real name. But he never went by that name because he was so cool and intense and he knew his writings were going to make people so mad, he actually went under a pen name instead. And some of you might have actually heard his name before, but we'll talk about him a little bit later in class, and I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.